So we're excited to be here with you this afternoon. Careful getting on the seats. They're very high. Before we get started and before I introduce our panelists, I wanted to set the stage for what we'll be talking about today by asking you. So if you look around, you're surrounded by alumni from Cornell who graduated from a wide range of colleges and degree programs and are now enjoying success in an even wider range of occupations and organizations. And my question to you is, what is it that unites us here today? Right? If you could take a moment and think about a distinctive feature of Cornell that makes you proud to be here today as an alumni, and then just briefly talk that over with your neighbor, someone who's sitting next to you. So you're all mentioning distinct memories, I think, of your time there. One thing that does unite us, I think, is our founding vision, right? You all remember what that is? Any person, any study, great. And the fact that we're a land-grant institution, the only one in the Ivy League, and that really defines who we are. And so, the point I wanted to make with that is that a true commitment to diversity and inclusion, it's in our DNA, right, as Cornellians. And I wanted to tell you actually a few facts about Cornell that you may or may not know that I think will make you feel proud in this way. So the first classes at Cornell included students from Haiti, Japan, Brazil, Russia, and Cuba. Did you know that? The first graduates from Cornell Law School included a former slave from Virginia. While the price of education at Harvard and Yale were beyond reach for many, at Cornell, Ezra Cornell believed that people should be able to access a Cornell education and had a program that he named, what did he name it? Earn While You Learn, which was a program through which students could work on local farms in order to pay their way through a Cornell education. Cornell's vision of racial and gender non-discrimination really was radical, especially when you think about the time. It was a time when discrimination against women and women of color was absolutely the norm. It was enshrined in law, and it was pervasive throughout higher education. Right? So to put this into perspective, the first black woman to graduate from Cornell was Sarah Winifred Brown in 1890. Princeton would not educate its first black student until 1942. Wow. Over a century after. And its first woman until 1969. Even Vassar, which is an all-women's was an all-women's college until it went co-ed in 1969, didn't change its policy to open its doors to women of color until 1942. Duke, by the way, did not desegregate until 1963. That's almost 100 years, right, after Cornell. 100, that's a lot of years. So a lot of first black PhDs also were earned at Cornell in disciplines far-ranging from mathematics to botany to nutrition. The first black fraternity, many of you may know, Alpha Phi Alpha, was founded by Cornell students in 1908. Years later, in 1982, a group of Cornell students founded the nation's first Hispanic fraternity. Cornell's administration then, and still today, argued that the benefits of diversifying the student body was for all students, that it elevated the tone of scholarship for everybody at Cornell. Cornell continues to demonstrate its practice, right, its commitment to diversity in practice through these guiding principles. As many of you may know, in October of 2017, our 14th president, President Pollock, she issued a statement underscoring the continuing importance of Ezra's founding vision, and she convened a presidential task force on campus climate. And the focus of that was for us to really try to understand how we could improve the student experience, the climate for our diverse student body. And as co-chair of that task force, and now as vice provost for undergraduate education, I can say with confidence that her commitment is real, and it feels really good to work at the university right now. So one thing I also wanted to tell you is that last month, were any of you at the Cornell Alumni Leadership Conference in Boston? Oh, great. So the keynote speaker, Rakesh Khurana, is a ILR alumnus and current dean of Harvard College. And what he said is he referred to this program that we have called the Intergroup Dialogue Project. And one of the recommendations that came out of the task force last year that we started doing last year was to require all incoming undergraduate students to participate in an intergroup dialogue session. That's 3,500 students. We did it in 4 days. We had 170 sessions of 20 students each. We had 80 facilitators. It was a monumental effort, right? This is at a university where the only other requirement is a swim test, right? But that goes to show you how important this is and how much we really wanted to communicate to students the moment they got on campus, that learning how to dialogue across difference is core to what it means to be a Cornellian. And so relative to that, Dean Khurana said, he referred to Cornell's Intergroup Dialogue Project as a method for moving higher education into the future and adapting to the modern political climate. I can't read my own handwriting. He said it is programs like ours that provide students with a deeply transformative experience intellectually, socially, and personally, and which are necessary for preparing them for a life of citizenship and leadership. So now you have a little bit of a sense of what's going on campus. And so we wanted to continue that conversation today and have you reconnect, right, with that part of your Cornell DNA, and to talk about what it is that you can do in your workplace to help co-create experiences of inclusion. So to help me do that, I have today a great panel. I'm faculty in the ILR school. You know, we're all about the world of work, so we're all over this kind of stuff. And so I have two successful ILR alumni who have dedicated their careers to improving the world of work through the HR function. So we have Tami Lamp, who is the Chief People Officer at Icertis, and Louis Montgomery, who is the practice leader for Human Resources and Diversity Officers Professional Search at Korn Ferry. And at ILR, we're inclusive, so we also invited Lisa Solomon, who is an alumna from Arts and Sciences. Lisa is an author and designer in residence at Stanford's D.school, design school, right? Okay. So I wanted to begin by just clarifying what it is that we mean when we talk about inclusion. My feeling is it's a very slippery construct, right? As my advisor used to say, it's like nailing Jell-O to the wall, right? And on the surface, it feels like we're talking about the same thing, but in my experience, sometimes it turns out people are talking about inclusion and leadership, so we're back to kind of notions of representation. In the academic literature, we're really focused on the conditions that make it possible to leverage diversity of thought in a way that adds up to what we call or produces super additivity, which is a notion that 1 + 1, right, equals 3, not 2. And so given this definition, I wanted to start out by asking Lisa, you've written a book about the impact of designing strategic conversations that include a multitude of perspectives. Why is that so important for strategy these days? And what does it mean to truly engage multiple perspectives?
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for including me in this event, and particularly in this panel. I'm excited to be a different perspective to add to it. And I really appreciate, Lisa, how you, first of all, started us all off from a common platform, right? That here we are coming from very different backgrounds, and we started off with a conversation about what we have in common. And that's actually a great practice in how you think of creating inclusive environments by starting off with something that actually generates conversation we can build on. That's something we can all start to do immediately. And in my work around thinking about design practices applied to conversations that are meant to accelerate change, that are meant to solve adaptive challenges that don't have single right answers, we must have a diversity of perspective and experiences around the table, or else we're going to end up with the same solution that probably didn't work in the past. And so bringing different perspectives together in a way that allows them to truly feel like they can include. And now I'm not talking about the sort of what I call the Noah's Ark of diversity, where you say, okay, we'll get 2 from compliance and 2 from product and 2 from marketing and 2 from global and 2 from this, and we're going to launch something, right? We're talking about really diversity of perspective across all elements and even the unexpected elements of the challenge you're trying to solve, framing it in a way that allows their ideas to come together to allow for some new novel insights. These are design skills. I mean, they're not unlike when you design a great product. You establish the criteria by which who needs to be around and how you're going to engage. And so I think it's something that all of us can embrace and have to embrace in a time of increasing complexity and change. And if we care about creating organizations that are both innovative and resilient, this is a practice we all have to know how to do.
That reminds me what you said about this meeting I went to once at Merck, and the chief diversity officer had brought me in, and she brought about 20 people in to have this conversation. A lot of the people in the room had not met each other. I had certainly not met them. And we had an hour and a half. And she asked us to all go around and introduce ourselves and also our connection to the topic that we were there to talk about. So beginning with that collective, right, that shared. We spent 45 minutes. That was half of our time, right, just introducing ourselves. And a lot of people would say, we don't have time for that. We got to get straight to the task. But what happened in the 45 minutes that followed, it would not have been possible had we not gone around the room and people would say, I'm a data junkie and this is what I like. And so as we started talking, people started connecting with each other instead of censoring what they were saying, wondering if what they were saying was obvious or interesting or boring or whatever. And so we got so much done in that second half, and I learned a really big lesson, right, of the importance of starting the conversation, really teeing up the conversation. Right. Okay, so next, now that we this is very difficult to hold. So now that we've established why inclusion is important, right, to really leverage perspectives for better thinking, what I'd like to do is talk a little bit about what every one of us can do to help promote inclusion. And the idea here is to shift from thinking about HR leaders as the ones who create inclusion. We're not passive recipients of inclusion, right? It's the everyday decisions, the choices that we make that help create an experience of inclusion for other people. And one thing we know is that our brains are wired such that we all, every one of us, make really quick inferences, right, about the world and about people. And reality, as we see it, is actually not as objective as we would like to think. And so being aware of that, continually vigilant about that, and then counteracting them with tools, right, for slowing down our thinking is something that's really important for promoting inclusion. So related to that, Lewis, I wanted to ask you, what are some of the practices or tools that you've seen utilized to counteract implicit bias?
Absolutely. Well, thanks, Lisa, and hello, everyone. Greetings from the East Coast, from the Washington, D.C. area. I've had an interesting journey in terms of my career. I started, I've always worked in human resources. Now I'm on the search side, so I'm in the process of finding people and for organizations. But I started my career as a college and professional recruiter. And one of the things that I learned as part of that process is that we all have our biases. We all love people from Cornell, and we don't necessarily like people from Brown and other kind of places like that. I'm kidding to a certain extent. But I saw a lot of that play out as part of our university recruiting efforts. And one of the things that we were focused on doing very specifically was working at ways to diversify our workforces, and we came up with a strategy to recruit at historically black colleges and universities for the idea of increasing the number of folks that we would have the opportunity to choose from. And we ran into some difficulties with the actual implementation of this, and this was in the early 80s. And one of the things that I learned and we ultimately began to do that I think was one of these things in terms of really most effective was really to provide training to managers. Again, we all have our biases and we all have our favorites. And so instead of just letting our managers go out and say, go forth and do good work, we had to provide them with some training. And we had to allow people to begin to confront in a respectful way their own biases, and to find ways in which we could acknowledge those kinds of things, so that, again, these biases wouldn't ultimately prevent us from being able to find good candidates. And I've seen that evolve over the years. It was not nearly as sophisticated back in the early 80s as it is now, and organizations have whole suites of training and interventions, not unlike what we have at Cornell. So it's really the kind of thing that you just can't presume that you want to have a great outcome. You've got to find ways in which to empower people, to help them confront their biases, and help them find ways in which to overcome them.
In a non-threatening way, right?
Yes,
yeah,
absolutely.
Yeah. So Tami, as a chief HR officer, it's important that you role model, right? The kind of behavior that you want to see in the people that work at your company. So could you talk a little bit about what you do to try to counteract the role of implicit bias in your thinking?
Yes, thank you very much. I'd love to build on what we were saying about the setup of a conversation. Find some commonality. You're always looking out there and looking at what is similar. What do I have in common with others? And then go into the biases. Most of our biases are, we have immediate reactions to people that are nonverbal. And these nonverbal factors influence how you're going to respond to that person. So one of the things we really try to role model and try to do as leaders and executives is continue to look inside. Why is it when I'm walking down a hall and I see 4 people that I just kind of nod to one, say hi to another, hug the other, be careful on that one, and then on the last person I slap them on the back? What is it about me that chose to treat those people differently? The other thing to look at is when you're walking down a hall going to lunch. You know, why is it you run as fast as you can past someone's office, and then you stop in the others to chit-chat and see how they're doing, and then you ask the next person to go? These type of behaviors that you're projecting as a leader are things that are creating exclusion in your organization. They can also hinder your organization from developing leadership and developing others. There are also things that make people feel not so great. You can see it in every organization. When you walk into a room, where do you choose to sit? You know, do you sit exactly across from the person that just sat down? Usually that means there's a conflict there. Do you sit right next to them all the time? I mean, there's just all these things that you have to continue to do to look inside about why am I behaving this way? And then continue to change yourself, to treat people fairly, equally, and not make comments like, I can't understand what they're saying, or they're so argumentative. It's like, well, what is it about you that can change that conversation? You know, can you slow down the speech? Could you have some written communication? Or if they're argumentative, what is it that you're doing that's leading that practice, or how are you responding to it? So I really think a great leadership behavior role models continue to look inside and evaluate why you do something, which builds on a lot of the tools that are being done nowadays around addressing unconscious bias.
Can I just build on that for a second, Tami? I love that, and I think you're also saying to pay attention to the small details along the way. And I think a lot of times, well, certainly it's wonderful that diversity and inclusion, equity are getting more airtime in the conversation. How they get practiced, though, comes down to those details. And it could be other things, too, like who are the heroes that are celebrated in your company? What are the stories that people tell regularly? Are they told equally by different perspectives? I'm constantly working hard to make sure that the stories that I share in my work as teaching at Stanford and when I give talks are representative of many different points of view, not just the sort of big hero stories that we see. How do you introduce people? Do you introduce people with generosity and with care to help them do their best work? These are things that, again, they're everyday behaviors around, am I doing everything I can to set this other person up for success, to feel fully seen and heard so that they can do their best work?
I must add to that, because
Yeah,
I think one of the common things we see in tech is the premise that you must work long hours. And automatically, if you celebrate the person who worked all night and all weekend on something to get it done, yay, I'm very thankful for what they did, but automatically you're excluding the people that have other commitments, that might have been more effective with their time, that might have parsed out their work and handed it to others. It's an automatic exclusion.
So, here we're talking about the things that we can do inside our own heads, right, to slow down our thinking, to be aware of whether it's our nonverbals or our verbals. I want to return to something that you started, you're talking about the details being really important. And, as humans, we're social creatures, right? So we're very influenced by process, by the environment that we create for decision making. That really plays out in the way that conversations unfold. Research, decades of research shows that upwards of 70% of teams underperform. 70%, right? And that's because of a lack of attention to detail. And so often the range of expertise and information that's actually present in a team ends up not being unearthed. Information ends up not being shared as openly as it could if you just leave it up to an open discussion format, which is so common. The final decision is going to end up being overly influenced by the person who speaks first or most assertively, right? And so to really counteract some of these dynamics that happen all the time, often without our awareness, but also often with our awareness when you're on the receiving end, right, of something that makes you feel excluded in that process. So in thinking about creating these decision-making contexts, right, designing them with the end goal in mind, what are some of the tricks that people can use?
That's a great question. I think starting backwards to say, when I have people leave this conversation, what do I want them thinking? What do I want them feeling? Do I want them thinking like that was a waste of time? Why was I even included? No one even asked me, or it didn't seem like that they really cared about my opinion. And if you care about making sure that everyone feels like their investment in that time was worthwhile, you can think about, well, what are all the ways I can make sure different perspectives feel like they can contribute? So for example, we often overlook the difference between extroverts and introverts. You'd mentioned that sometimes the loudest voice tends to carry forward. You can make a choice to say, look, we're going to come up with a new idea, or we want to get your opinion on this. I want to just take a quiet moment. Can you just write down some ideas? So that way the introverts, have a chance to express themselves. You can then say, okay, now turn to a pair and share. And then you can work your way to a more public forum. So just slowing down to do some of those things. Paying attention to the things that often get in the way, like status. A lot of times, some of the more junior folks in the room that have the most brilliant, vibrant ideas don't feel free to speak up. And so you have to hear about the fact they had ideas after the fact. And you have to ask, what's stifling that point of view? And as we were prepping, I shared a story. One of my most vivid examples, a colleague of mine was working on innovation within the military. And they were doing a brainstorming session related to their strategic plan. And over lunch, he rewrote every single Post-it note that was generated in the morning session because he didn't want the more junior people to recognize the handwriting of the general, which would have then just led them to be like, that one, right? So there are these tiny little details you can say, if what I really care about is inclusion, how do I make sure I'm paying attention to allowing those voices and those ideas to come forward?
Another thing that groups can do, one thing that we know about the way the brain works is that our brain processes coherent, consistent information much more easily, right? It doesn't create discomfort. And so one-sided arguments, we tend to feel overconfident about one-sided arguments. That's something to keep in mind, right? Which means that we're less likely to invite counter-arguments into a conversation. So one thing that teams can do, something that's called a pre-mortem. So you say, okay, assume, so you're about to make the final decision, and you say, okay, assume we made this decision, we've implemented it, a year down the road, turns out it's a disaster. Tell a story of what happened. Why was it a disaster? And when you ask it that way, it opens people up not to censor counter-arguments, but to be really creative in considering them, right? And maybe the novices, right, or maybe the people who otherwise don't speak are then freed to offer their opinions a little bit more. If you want to add anything more before we start talking about a little bit more about what kinds of leaders we might want to choose?
Yeah, let's talk more about leaders. Yeah, let's get into that.
Okay.
I'd want to go into decision-making.
Okay.
One thing is, decision-making really slows down business. If you can't make a decision and your organization can't follow you and they don't understand the why, people can't get behind this. We hear a lot about change leadership, change management. one of the things around inclusion is to be really, really clear in advance of someone speaking their mind what their role is in that decision. Because if you're actually asking, we were having a conversation earlier, if you're actually asking people that have no expertise on a topic, why are you asking them? Are you asking them for a completely different perspective? Are you asking them because you feel too entrenched in the subject matter that you maybe can't think about a revolutionary idea that would come to it, or you have no end user experience? Why are you asking an expert? So when that person provides their input and you either turn away and ignore it, or you land on it, everybody in the room is wondering why you did what you did. So I think it's been really powerful in organizations I've found where teams are incredibly effective, where you walk in and there's a number of different models out there, but we've used one, ORPE, regularly. And it's like, okay, I'm the owner of this decision and I'm gonna drive the collaboration and the feedback, and I'll be clear in the end what I did with everybody's input and why I made that decision. Because then it's really clear it's not the three of us making that decision. You know, it's me. And so people don't feel dismissed.
Right. And if they understand that, they're more likely to speak up next time because they're not going to assume there's no point in speaking up. They understand what.
And their role could be different next time.
Right.
Their role in this might be that they are actually really included in that, or they're supposed to come prepared with some information, or their role might be, I'm going to inform you of how the meeting went. So don't show up. You know, so we're all about teamwork and collaboration, but in many cases people feel excluded because they don't understand how come I wasn't heard, how come I wasn't listened to, and you find that it's incredibly effective if you clarify that before someone shares their thoughts.
Great. So for those of you who are in a position to choose, right, the people who lead your organization, specifically lead your diversity and inclusion efforts, I thought it might be useful to ask Louis in particular, given your role now, you've placed a lot of people in chief diversity officer type jobs. And if you could tell us a little bit about the competencies that make people successful, and if there are any unexpected lessons you've learned along the way, right? Maybe spectacular failures that surprised you, or prior experiences that ended up really being critical for people's success?
Sure, absolutely. Yeah, I had the really good fortune. It didn't necessarily feel like it was good fortune at the time, but I worked early in my career as a diversity practitioner, and this was in the 90s, and it was in the transition time between affirmative action and diversity. In fact, my first title in that space was affirmative action and diversity. Affirmative action was very clear. Diversity was not clear, and so part of what we had to figure out was, how do we make this real? And it's been interesting is how it's evolved over time. Initially, it was diversity, then it became diversity and inclusion, and now it's diversity, equity, and inclusion. And so I've had the sort of unique perspective of having been a practitioner, and then now, as Lisa mentioned, I place chief diversity officers inside organizations, and there have been some very interesting lessons that we've learned along the way, and we've actually done some research in terms of what are the key competencies for the most effective diversity officers. And I'd say the lessons that we've learned is that the background that the person comes from, no surprise, is absolutely important, because especially now, these roles are side by side, shoulder to shoulder with the chief executives of organizations and/or the chief HR officers, because organizations have said for years, people are our most important resource. But I think now organizations really understand it, because it's really all about talent. So the kinds of things that we've seen that make most effective diversity officers are, one, folks who can be very strategic, who are able to translate whatever that organization's strategy into what does this ultimately mean in terms of our talent systems. So that's one of the very important things. Something else that we discovered that was kind of an interesting thing that we didn't necessarily expect was that courage is something that is a very important leadership attribute for chief diversity officers. And the reason for it, as you think about it, you wouldn't have these roles if things ran as they should. And so these are folks who are going up against the status quo, up against years and years of institutional knowledge and learning. And so it can be very difficult. So the willingness to be able to challenge the way things have been is a very, very important attribute as well. And then something also related to that is the ability to manage conflict. I know that one of the sort of my first mentors in this space was a woman who had responsibility for affirmative action. And she was very effective in that, but affirmative action was really about combat in a lot of ways, both internally as well as with the external government organizations. And she was a very, very combative person and was effective in doing that. But as we've learned over time, being combative is not necessarily going to be a recipe for success. Conflict is inevitable. But those people who can effectively manage the conflict are going to be those who are going to be most effective. So I think those are some of the lessons along the way, and I'm happy to tell more war stories during the networking break.
Yeah, we like to focus on dialogue, right? As being Cornell is very different from debate even.
Right.
So I want to just return to one of the first things you said, which is you need people obviously to be strategic in their thinking. I've seen companies more recently hire people not from the HR function who have talent-specific experience, for example, but from the business. What has been your read on that?
Yeah, it's a mixed bag. I think some of the early practitioners came from business because, again, this was a new field and there was really no track record. And so people came from a variety of places. People came from community affairs was not an uncommon place for people to come from. But it's interesting. I was thinking about the most recent placements that I've made. One person was an attorney who was an executive director of a social justice organization and then became a diversity practitioner. And another person was an electrical engineer who was always being asked to help with finding sources of candidates for their organization, and ultimately decided that was the way to go in. So the thing I've seen is that there's a lot of paths to get into this space. HR is certainly one of the most common and most effective because so much of the work is really about talent. But there have been, again, a lot of very successful practitioners that have come from other places, that have come from being chiefs of staff inside of organizations as well.
I just want to build on that, Liz. I think it's so interesting that being a strategic thinker is so critical. And if you think about where the diversity conversation has been, where it is today, and where is it going, if we think about it, it has to be tied to the future of work, to the future of human contributions. That is going to inevitably shift as we think about the blend of humans working with machines, which we're going to hear more about, I think, throughout this program. As we think about the different kinds of people that work within an organization, as boundaries blur, you're working with contingent workers, you're working with strategic partners that may not come from your organization. So if we think about what does it mean to have a diversity of the most talented workforce on behalf of the purpose of the organization, it's really going to shift the way that we think about what does diversity mean, and how do we have that strategic lens as we allow everyone within the organization to come forward doing their best work.
Yep. Thank you for that, Tami. Do you want to add anything?
Good, thank you.
We are doing really well on time. Okay, so we've talked, about things that you might be able to do, paying closer attention to what's going on inside, to the decision-making context, to maybe the kinds of leaders that you choose. I wanted to ask you, Louis, one more question. So from your vantage point as a former Chief Diversity Officer, what's your perspective on the role of dialogue and debate, I suppose, in helping us as a nation make progress, especially in light of movements such as Me Too, NFL players' protests, and Black Lives Matter?
Yeah, no, thanks for that. One of I've encouraged my kids to do this, and I wish that I had done it growing up. I think that things like speech debate really matter because, again, so much of what we do and so much of the progress that we make is because of conversations that we have. And frankly, I'm an optimist. I wouldn't be an executive recruiter if I were not an optimist, because we'd get some pretty challenging assignments, but we always feel like we're going to find that needle in the haystack. More broadly, I'm an optimist because I think that the things like you've talked about, the whole Me Too movement, Black Lives Matter, the NFL players' protests, I think these things are good for society because these are issues that we have had in our society for a long, long time. and in many cases, they've never been dealt with. So when I hear about these things, I think it makes me feel hopeful for the future that we're discussing these things and that we're having meaningful dialogue about really, really tough issues that don't necessarily have easy solutions. I was driving home the other day and I was listening to National Public Radio, and there were two professors debating reparations, and I'm like, wow! I mean, what a conversation to have. And there's no easy answer to that, because there's clearly a movement and discussion about that. But these are the kinds of things that, again, as a society, we need to discuss. And one of the things I was thinking is that, as a student of history, is that why wasn't that discussion held 150 years ago, when it was really, I think, most relevant? But the point is, it needs to be discussed, and it's being discussed now. And ultimately, I think we'll come to the appropriate resolutions. And in some cases, the resolution is we have to agree to disagree, but at least there's a conversation about it.
I'd love to build on that. A couple of practical things, just in your day-to-day business life. One is help each other. If someone does something when you're working alongside them, or if you're in a community or on anywhere, and you appreciate it, speak up. Say, hey, thank you. Thank you. I really liked that. Because you continue to reinforce the positive. The other thing would be, one of the practices when you're interviewing is I often encourage people to do panel interviews. So to have multiple people listening to a person respond to a question. Many times you'll see one-on-one series of interviews, which isn't super effective if you look at the research. So when you do that, after debriefing, you'll learn that the three of us all saw that person differently. And then we can have a conversation about the skill sets, what we heard, and that will align us onto what we're looking for in our organization, what affects our culture, what type of people we are, and it also brings us closer together. So I'd encourage two practical things. Affirm, really give the positive kudos, and then also to continue to have discussions about what you heard on things with others. The one last note on this, the people that spend time alone by themselves and don't get perspective from others on things, it becomes a hard place for them. It becomes a place where they see the media, they see the news, they have their own thoughts on things, but the ability to interact and communicate is really what makes us, I think, better people and leaders.
Yeah, I mean, one thing, in connecting these two ideas is this notion of a leader as a learner. If you think, we have a lot of difficult issues that are rising up every day, that are polarizing, and we are in an increasingly divisive environment. As leaders, can we approach it through the lens of curiosity and through learning? To say, wow, that's a very different perspective than I have. Can you share more about why you have that? I'd like to learn. Not, I want to prove you wrong. Look at this, all these tweets that prove you wrong. I mean, so if we get into a discovery mindset, I think we can find more common ground from which to build. And perhaps, that's where really the juicy insights are, and that's what fuels innovation. It's sort of the stuff between the ideas, if you're open to it. And I think, a healthy, resilient environment is one that encourages discourse. I don't think that the goal of efforts around diversity and inclusion are around to kind of keep everything flat and comfortable. Right. I think it's to make it safe so that people can share their ideas without feeling that they might get punished for it or ostracized for it, and to be rewarded for that, because that is where the good stuff is. I mean, when you have emotions rising, dig deeper, because you're either really excited about something or you're really worried about something, and that's where the energy is. So if we try to keep things neutral and flat, we're just going to miss it all. So I think it's really important to make sure that our job is to actually promote some energy in the room, but not to make it so that it's so unsafe that we feel like we can't, that we're not welcome or it's not allowed.
Yeah, and that, that's really kind of the spirit behind what this big initiative that we have on campus right now. What we were seeing is that students would disagree, and I don't like your idea, therefore I don't like you, and I'm not going to engage with you. And it was a negative interaction, and there were bias incidents that made it to the Cornell Sun. Remember the Cornell Sun? It really damaged our campus climate in many ways. And what we realized is that students need the tools, they need to know what's expected of them, and then they need the tools to be able to do it, and the practice, right, to become better at it, which is in that moment to really try to understand why somebody is saying that. You don't have to agree, but just try to listen to understand, right, not to argue against, and learn how to do that. And we tell them it's a shortcut to really, really rapidly opening up your worldview, right? Is to learn through the lens of somebody else. Learn why it is that somebody sees the very same event totally differently. And what we see is that students are reveling in this opportunity to learn from each other, and they're learning an incredible amount about themselves. And the college years are a great time to do this, right? Because they're just going through a really formative period where they're almost adults, but they're still forming their identities, their social identities, and their personal identities. And so they're very receptive and spongy. I like to call them spongy, right? In the right circumstances. So that's what we're investing in at Cornell right now. And our belief very much is that, you know, together as Cornellians, we're positive agents of change for the public good.
Yeah, I've seen some great things happen inside of organizations around what are now called employee resource groups. They used to be called affinity group. In some cases, they're called business resource groups. And what it's done is it's exposed people in a fun, but ultimately a way that's very engaging to different organizations and cultures. And, you know, through food and dance and other kinds of things. And it gives people the opportunity in a very safe environment to experience things that they would ordinarily not experience. And I've seen just a lot of good stuff come out of that. And it's again sort of, you know, it can be somewhat institutionalized inside of organizations, but it can be very, very informal as well. And I think that's one of the reasons that, again, I'm optimistic and I'm hopeful, because I see more and more of these kinds of things. And, you know, there was a time where those organizations were sort of, you know, held at arm's length, whereas when inside of more progressive organizations, they are welcomed. Executives get attached to these organizations, and they get funding, and they do really, really good work for their organizations.
I'm smiling because you're making me almost remember my Cornell experience, like the affinity groups of the different colleges, right? But there was something about eating together, you know, that would bring us to, give us a chance to learn from each other about our experiences. And there is something to that about having a higher purpose that unifies you with the allowance of you to go deeper into your areas, but still find a way to connect with others.
Sure.
I feel hopeful too. So, I think we're about out of time. I don't know if we have any, do we have any time for questions?
I think we were going to do questions at the break.
Okay. All right. So we'll I think, move from this into a networking. No, not networking, a session. So I won't talk about what's on the program. Thank you very much, everybody.
Thanks.
Thank you.